thank you so much, Ethan, for joining me today. Sincerely, it has been a wild ride for a lot of folks in this space, and I caught word of your insight and wisdom that you were giving on LinkedIn, and that's what inspired me to reach out to you and see if we could start a conversation on this platform. And thank you so much for joining me. If maybe you could just give a little bit of information about you and your background, and yeah, and any other information you'd like to give to introduce yourself.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So my name's Ethan Evans. I am a retired Amazon employee who then transitioned into building my own business in coaching and teaching leadership, building courses on leadership. But of course, a lot of the people who look to me for guidance are either former Amazonians who are at other places or current Amazonians looking to navigate the system. So quickly, I spent 12 years in startups before Amazon. I joined Amazon in 2005, and I worked there through the start of the work from home pandemic period, leaving the company only after my team was in good shape in the pandemic in September of 2020. And so, I'm very interested in the return to office issue simply because I'm being asked about it by Amazonians in my network, since I do a lot of online coaching and consulting with people about how to manage their careers. So I have a little bit more to say about that, of course, but that's who I am. And yeah, let's take it from there.
Awesome. Right on. Well, thank you so much. I've documented a few questions on my end, and thought about some things that we could talk about from more of like a general remote work place, and maybe we can get into some Amazon specific remote questions as well. How does that sound?
It sounds good. If you don't mind, I'd like to sort of frame something right up front, if that's okay.
Absolutely. Please.
Yeah, so I've, of course, thought about this issue a lot since I first posted and since you and I first got in contact. And I want to be clear that at this point, I'm of two minds. On the one hand, I enjoy working remotely, and I'm very aware that there's a lot of data that supports the value of remote work, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. And that's what caused me to come out and say I'm not supportive of Amazon's policy a few weeks ago. I've spent a lot more time thinking about it, though. And the thing I want to be clear is normally I'm an Amazon advocate. And so I've tried and tried to figure out, why is Amazon pushing return to office? And why, contrary to how we would write documents internally, which we'll talk about more, are they doing that without sharing any real data? The key thing that sticks out to me is that the public statements, including those that have been made internally and then shared, the statements not just to the greater public, but to the employees, don't contain any data. They say, we believe this or we think that, and we've decided on 3 days back in the office. That strikes me as relatively un-Amazonian. So we can explore that more, but what I'm trying to understand is I normally have high faith in the Amazon leadership. I'm trying to untangle what they're thinking, because none of this is accidental. It's possible they've made a mistake or a misjudgment, but they're not doing it blindly. And so that's what I'm really interested to discuss is the policy doesn't make sense to me. How can we try and make sense of it? And then, of course, since I believe in remote work, how might we advocate for remote work if that's the right solution?
Thank you, Ethan. I appreciate that. Nice framing. Well, I mean, now you've got me thinking more about the Amazon specific questions.
Yeah, we can start with true remote work and then get into Amazon, because I think the value of remote work, we can go through that quickly, but there is a lot of proven value. And establishing that, which I think you've done a lot in your petition, is valuable also.
Awesome. All right. Well, I guess start with, how has your perception of remote work changed over time, in Amazon and then outside of Amazon?
Yeah, so my first experience with remote work goes back well before I worked for Amazon. It goes back to a startup I worked with around the year 2000. And I had an employee, that startup was based in Washington, D.C., and we had remote employees in Colorado and Dallas, Texas, just individuals. One of those people was sort of productive, and my opinion of him as a remote worker was, he's okay. The other individual was incredibly productive. He was one of our star employees. So my first real exposure to remote work was, wow, this guy is tremendous. We're so lucky to have him. And the fact he works in Dallas and all the rest of us are in the office here in Washington, D.C., seems to make no difference. He gets more done, if anything. And of course, he would fly in occasionally to visit, but he was a full-time remote employee, and it worked brilliantly. So that was my first experience with, well, this can work kind of, sort of poorly, Colorado, or incredibly well, Dallas. Then over time, I saw more cases of people working remotely, not too much in early Amazon. But if we fast forward to the era of the pandemic, I was leading my team, and I remember very dramatically sending my team a message that said, hey, this pandemic thing, I think in a few days we may have to work from home for a couple weeks. We might want to figure out what that looks like. Like, we may only have a couple more days in the office to plan what it would be like to be home for several weeks. How do we do that? And so, of course, that sounds woefully naive 3 years later. But at the time, the idea we might be home for a few weeks was novel. And so we started talking about how we would do it and tell everyone to take home their laptop every night in case the offices got closed and so on. And as you know, of course, this turned into everyone working remote under different sort of lockdown orders. Well, that was the period I was still leading my team at Amazon. And so I watched my team go through that period for about 6 months, and there were definitely adaptations we had to make. We had people that chose to work at midnight, but then felt free to message others at midnight and engage them. And so we had to set norms around, like, feel free to work whenever you want, but don't expect your teammates to jump on to answer you at midnight. Another thing we had to do is, during that period, people didn't want to take vacation because they're like, I'm not even allowed to leave my house. Why would I take a day off? And so to give our team a breather, we agreed to take one Friday a month and make it an everybody takes the day off day, as a way of, you can take a day off and not feel guilty that, like, you're just falling behind. It was a way to give people a break. And then fast forward all the way to today, I've been, since I left Amazon, and to the degree I work part-time for myself at home. I've been working from home for 3 years. I'm starting to notice some of the loneliness from that. In other words, the social network I had by spending 8 hours a day in the office, or 10, has changed. And so I would say I've seen a lot of things evolve. And I think I have maybe not a perfect view of the pluses and minuses of both scenarios, but I think I've now seen some of the short-term and long-term.
I appreciate you sharing that with me, Ethan. I did want to get into some of the biggest benefits of remote work for employees, and those key advantages that you've seen over the time throughout your remote experience.
Well, so advantage number one of my team leaders, a bright engineering leader, she had the idea to track her team's productivity. She ran 2-week sprints. And of course, sprints have points, if you're at all familiar with how agile development works. And she tracked her team's productivity on the 2-week periods where we spent 10 days working, and the 2-week periods where we spent 9 days working, because we were taking a day as like a team break. And it turns out the 9-day sprints were more productive. So that right there was eye-opening to me, like, oh, that's interesting. Now, is this a huge study? No, it's a study of one done over a few sprints. The second thing is, she had sprint data. She had kept this data of her team's velocity pre-pandemic, working in the office, and post-pandemic. And at least in that early period of the pandemic, when people were trapped at home and honestly didn't have a lot of other things to do, we were much more productive from home. So generally, one of the benefits is, while that's a specific case, many businesses and many employees both measured and perceived, report higher productivity from home. Generally, this is perceived that they're not commuting. So my commute, for example, was 90 minutes each way each day. I live quite a long distance from Seattle. So I was leaving my house at 7:30 in the morning and getting back at 7:30 at night. So 9 hours in the office, 12 hours on the road, 1 hour working remotely on mass transit during that, or an hour and a half, and the rest in other forms of transit. Pretty heavy schedule. I got 3 hours a day back where I could sit at my desk and still have more time with my family. So on a personal level, I experienced what a lot of people experience, the ability to both give more time to work and be more productive, as well as to spend more time at home and have a better life. That to me is the big win I saw. I know there are others you may want to mention as well.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I have some experience in this space ever since I kind of made that decision to be a remote worker, and kind of wanted to, make sure that that was a part of my schedule personally. With you, how do you maintain this effective communication with the colleagues while working remotely? I feel like that is a big issue that comes up quite often in discussions with leadership.
Yeah, it definitely takes it's an adaptation, a different intentionality. And there's a lot of talk about, missing the water cooler conversations, the informal. I think there was some evidence, and we saw within our team, that while individual contributor workloads somewhat went down, managerial workloads tended to go up, because managers had to do more work to set up calls and reach out to employees and keep in touch or ask questions. While I don't have firm data on it, and again, I wouldn't have it at scale, the managers in our team reported like, oh yeah, keeping in touch with everyone, having 15-minute check-ins is more work than what I did in person in the office. That said, I think part of that work is manageable in the sense that we didn't educate workers originally on help us out, volunteer some stuff, put it in status, reach out. So I don't think in those first few months we had time to develop new norms. Remember, throughout much of the pandemic, and certainly the 6 months I was there, it was constant discussion of when will this end? How soon will we be back in the office? And that how soon was usually measured in aspirational weeks. So I don't think there was a lot of investment in like, we have to find a permanent new way to work better or smarter. And I think that is very possible. And I think now, 3 years in, a lot of people have adapted, maybe not perfectly, but again, think about how tool support has changed. I believe Amazon Chime has seen investment. Certainly Zoom and Skype and Teams and other communication tools have seen investment. There have been whiteboards, there have been other things added. I think there's tool options to help with some of that, but it is a challenge, right? Humans by default interact in person. It's sort of been our history over thousands of years. And figuring out how to move all of that to be virtual is difficult.
Yeah, I agree with that. Um, so over the time of working remotely, what sort of challenges have you encountered in the space of working remotely, and how have you overcome them? I know you did mention that the loneliness factor did start to kick in a little bit. Has that changed and morphed over time, or has that been pretty steady for you? And yeah, what sort of things have you changed in your day-to-day to overcome this challenge?
Yeah, great question. Honestly, that's a relatively new development for me. I only started feeling it in the last 3 to 6 months, really feeling it. And when I inspected why I was feeling it, I realized part of it is driven by some of my local friends who had the freedom to do so moving out of the city. So I not only lost sort of my workplace contacts, my daily office contacts, but friends, whether they worked for Amazon or not, have moved away because they wanted to live in other places, and remote work gave them the chance to do that. So what I've done intentionally about that is first connect to some of them. Say, oh, I'm going to need to do a little bit more to reach out. And second, think about, well, who do I want to connect to locally? In other words, if I'm missing human interaction, maybe like one of my friends has moved to Sun Valley, Idaho. If I'm not going to see him as much, who else can I hang out with? And so just thinking about, okay, I have to adapt. But I don't think it's a insurmountable problem. It just is one that sort of snuck up on me, where it wasn't until I felt the feeling that then I could work backwards and say, oh, what has changed? Oh, I have less contact. I didn't know that I was feeling that. Now, what do I want to do about it? So I don't feel crippled by it. And again, though I no longer work for Amazon, I would rather spend a few extra minutes calling a friend or driving to visit the friend than have 3 hours a day of commute 5 days a week. Like that trade is still an easy one.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Um, I wanted to touch on contributing to diversity and inclusion as far as the workspace goes and how remote work can benefit this.
Yeah, so this is interesting. I have contact with someone who is in a minority, works for Amazon. And unsolicited, we were talking about this, and he shared with me, one of the things he's concerned about is that Amazon's offices, particularly in Seattle, which is our single largest office, are not really in an area that's known for its diversity. And so he's worried that Amazon would love to attract diverse talent, but its offices are not in places super known for their broad diversity. And is that going to be a handicap compared to being able to hire from anywhere? There's also the challenge, leaving Amazon totally out of it, just any company, that there's a lot of evidence that work from home has really benefited women, and particularly women with children that, as we know, bear the disproportionate responsibility for housework and child rearing. Now, there's a lot of things that should be fixed there, right? Men should step up, or partners should step up and do more of that work. But the facts are the facts. And there's a lot of evidence that women are disproportionately benefited by work from home, and they're disproportionately hit hard by office and commuting, as reflected in, reported anyway, lots of women exiting the workforce during the pandemic and after. So overall, there's a lot of things about remote work that can level the playing field. For example, if you develop on whatever technology, like we're using Zoom right now, the idea that to speak, you're going to use the raise hand function, that also can benefit people who are quieter. So another type of diversity is introvert versus extrovert, or people from minorities and underrepresented groups may not be as comfortable just jumping in. I've heard from many people in underrepresented groups that Zoom technology or video technology really helped them feel like they were on a level playing field. They're shown the same size. They can, nobody can tell their height. They can use the tools to get their fair share of a conversation more than in a room where the dynamics are more fluid. So I don't personally know where any of these effects have been quantified. I suspect they have, particularly the one around women and the impact on women. But everything I know indicates that remote work had some advantages for diversity.
I absolutely love that response so much. I resonate with that on a really big level. And I've also been in some private conversations in that space too, with minorities and women, and talking about the fact that they have to include, upwards of $1,500 to $2,000 now extra per month for childcare, and other different things that they have to encounter in that space. What role do you see remote work playing in the future? Now that we're in this space of being remote from the pandemic, now returning to office for some very large companies in this space, and how can companies transition to this remote first work model effectively going forward?
Yeah, so there definitely are some large companies that are transitioning back to the office, at least in part. There are also, some beacon large companies that are not. So Airbnb, for example, not surprisingly committed to full remote since that's kind of their business, but it's a huge decision. I work with some people from Airbnb and they talk about, it being a pillar of how they are going to work. The key, I think, though, is so many benefits have come out with remote work. I believe that some companies will lean in to how to solve the problems in order to get those benefits. And I think of it as a path forward versus a path back. Now that we've shown that people can work remotely for 3 full years, small companies, large companies, none is, of course, an exaggeration, but none of the companies we're discussing went out of business or suffered overly much. They're still here and still doing well 3 years later. So clearly remote work can work. I look at it, I love history. And I believe it was the French nobility didn't like the idea of guns because any peasant idiot could load and fire a gun and kill a knight or a noble. And so they tried to outlaw guns. We're going to stay in the days of knights in shining armor. The result is in the next war where one side had guns and they had knights in shining armor, they got slaughtered. I believe that remote work is the future. And I believe that because no matter what's better for the company, there may be an argument that somehow offices are better for the company. Remote work is so much better for so much talent that companies that figure out how to make that work are in a position to capitalize on that talent and profit. Essentially, some people will work in an office that gives you one pool to hire from. Some people will work only from home, and that gives you a bigger pool. And in a talent-based world, which all these large tech companies and others compete in, it seems like it favors those that are going to pull from all the talent. And so if I were starting a company today, for sure, I would be thinking about how to do it remote only or remote as a big option, a fully supported option. And I think that's the future.
Thank you, Ethan. I appreciate that. So that kind of concludes the overall general remote work questions. And I know we did touch on a little bit of Amazon specific things within those general remote. Is it all right if we kind of transition into some more Amazon specific remote questions?
Yeah. And, I want to, as I said in my opening, I'm really curious to try and figure out what Amazon is thinking. Amazon as personified by the leadership driving this decision. So I do want to talk about it because they have a reason that makes sense to them. And I can't figure out exactly what that is. I'm clear in what I just said that I think remote is the future. Clearly they don't. And I can't reconcile that difference. So I'd love to have this conversation.
Awesome. So first on the docket, how did Amazon's approach to remote work evolve during your time there, for instance? And what overall challenges did employees face while working remotely in your experience?
Yeah, it's a great question. Everything I want to refer to here is a matter of public record. It's been discussed in the media, at least the sources. So remote work began suddenly based on government pressure, government decree. Please stay home. Please work from home. Please have your workforces. And then that evolved even more to like shelter in place or other extreme orders. So in the beginning, the work from home was mandated. first recommended for a few days, and then it became a mandate. And over time, that evolved as the pandemic drew out much longer than people expected. That evolved and evolved, but essentially the companies for a long period of time had no choice. They first had no choice under mandates, and Amazon didn't. Then they had no choice under like social pressure. There may or may not have been a mandate, but with vaccines not out or shots not yet effective or available to everyone, it would have been untenable to say, oh, everyone come back. And you can look at Amazon's necessary workforce, its workforce that was considered critical in the warehouses, and all the efforts Amazon took to be able to even maintain its warehouses and operate them. Given that that work was required to be in person and the office work was not required in the same way, we continued to stay at home. Now, what problems I saw? Equipment, getting home offices. I had people who lived in small apartments. And so they were going crazy because some of my team members who were lived alone, maybe in a studio, were feeling very trapped and isolated, partly because they couldn't come to the office, but they were also having to like work on a couch. They didn't have a proper desk. They didn't have a workspace. The desk I'm sitting at now was a purchase in order to support remote work because I didn't have a good workspace myself at home because I was at the office all the time. So that was one problem. Then we mentioned the problem workers had with overwork, getting sucked in. And I think the list of problems goes on. In my piece of the industry, which at that time was video games, we had engineers and people who needed to be in working on physical equipment. And so they either had to bring the equipment home or try to go in alone and get into, a chance to use it when other people weren't there for safety reasons. So there were a lot of difficulties. But I wouldn't say those difficulties impacted most people or most of the work I managed or that I saw others managing that was software work. That's basically my part of my job. Now, how it's evolved after I left, I'm less clear on, for Amazonians. But I think the other thing that's commonly cited is onboarding new people. So Amazon grows rapidly. It isn't growing right now, but it normally grows rapidly. It also has relatively, I guess it has industry normal turnover. I'm not going to make some statement about high or low turnover, but industry normal turnover is still like 10%. And so each year, that's a huge number of people. So between growth and turnover, normally through Amazon's history, half the people are new every 2 years. You probably know, since you work at Amazon, there's this thing called the old fart tool. And it used to take only 2 years to be in the first half of employees. By the time I left, after 15 years, I was like in the first 1% of employees who were still with the company. In that world where you have to onboard half new people every 2 years, and the pandemic is 3 years old, there's been a lot of pain training people, getting them up to speed, keeping the culture, setting up connections between teams. And I think, as best I can figure out, that is the main thing driving the leadership to want people back in the office. We can get to that later, but I think that fundamental turnover, new person orientation, and culture sharing is the most logical explanation I can find so far.
Thank you, Ethan. So how did remote work affect collaboration while you were there, and communication among Amazon specific teams? And how did the company support employee well-being and overall work-life balance?
So answering the second part of your question first, how did the company support work-life balance and overall well-being? Early on, the company left a lot of decisions to individual leaders, and I think that worked well. For example, something that I did, I mentioned I gave my team one Friday a month off. It later came down, please don't do that. Please don't change work schedules. Well, we had already done it and we didn't pull it back. But it sort of came down, it's not in the authority of individual managers to change employee work schedules away from a 5-day week. Well, we had already done it. We stuck with it. The important point is, and I was told by my successor that continued for years after I left. So clearly no one was at least policing that. They were letting local leaders do whatever they needed to do to drive their business and operate with their team. I know that my peer leader who built games and had those engineers who needed to be in collaborating and working together on a creative product and with audio technology and other technology that was sort of office-based, they came back to the office more as soon as they could. And if you look through the games development industry, return to office had a much stronger force much earlier, just to give you a contrast. So the point is, I think one thing Amazon did well is let individuals pick. Could you repeat the first part of your question? I've lost track of it since I answered the second half.
All right, no problem. How did remote work affect the collaboration and communication among the Amazon teams?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I can't answer for all of Amazon. I can answer for what I saw and maybe what some people have told me. And there is some really interesting research. There's public research by a former Amazonian. His name is Michael Arena. And he was in charge of, if I have this right, can be verified, he was in charge of leadership development and employee development for AWS. And then he, at some point, left Amazon and went back to a professorial job. But he's led some research on remote work. And what it shows, and I'm sure he at least is partly informed by his Amazon experience, but what his research shows is that collaboration within teams tightened. In other words, within a small team, everybody talked more and they were on, like Amazon, for example, brought in Slack. And that would have never happened. That was like anathema prior to bring in an external technology that we didn't own and control like that and use so deeply. But it came in very quickly. Slack came into Amazon quite quickly once the need was seen. So then the teams are in Slack and they're communicating. But his research also shows that over time, the connections between teams, the more disparate long distance connections faded because you don't know someone in that team. And maybe it's harder to set up a meeting with a team that you don't know or that's not your team. So there was some impact in both ways. I will say another thing. I don't know how long you've worked for Amazon. Did you ever work in an Amazon office physically?
No, I've had the opportunity to be flexible and choose when to go in over the past 8 months of being here as an employee. But no, it was never the norm.
Yeah, okay. So back when that was the norm, there was ferocious competition for conference rooms. And there's an internal tool to schedule conference rooms. One of the big problems was getting a conference room for meetings. And that would actually be the primary force delaying meetings, either with a team or between a team. Well, the great thing, of course, is the virtual world has unlimited conference rooms. It's sort of actually an analogy to Amazon's unlimited shelf space for books, right? You can have as many Zoom conference rooms or Chime rooms as you need. So some people found it freeing because they could schedule a meeting without worrying about a conference room. Now, how that will play out back in the office, it's really interesting. I would say many of the back to office things aren't solved. And there's challenges as I hear them secondhand with space and is it going to be virtual desks and whatever. But that conference room challenge probably remains a big one. And I think almost everyone can agree that the worst possible solution is to have people commute to an office only to Zoom or only to use Chime from their desk rather than their homes. That's like, well, you've got this terrible argument of unwinnable argument of well, you can't work well through Chime, except now you're in the office and need to use Chime. That would be a disaster, I think. That said, those are a few of the things where I saw both Amazon's support with technology bringing in Slack, the benefits of unlimited virtual conference space, and some of the problems.
That's interesting you brought that up, Ethan. I've heard some conversation. I've been in some conversations in that space of when we get back to office, what are we going to do as far as meetings go? And to touch back on your inclusion and diversity perspective of the benefits of using virtual meeting rooms, and then also now you're touching on the space factor. It seems that some people, leadership, are inclined to continue using virtual office spaces when we're back in the office because that is their preferred method. So I guess in general, what are your thoughts on Amazon's return to office mandate? I know we touched on it a little bit at the beginning, but just maybe going into a little bit more detail. And, how do you think it will impact, employees' work-life balance, well-being, kind of making full circle on that, and the company's ability to retain this top talent that they've acquired over the years?
Yeah, it's a great question. First, let me speak personally. I've battled weight all my life. I grew up overweight. I lost the weight, but it's a constant struggle to keep it off. When the pandemic started and I was at home, I know some people talk about like the COVID-19, they put on 19 pounds. Well, I lost almost that much. Being at home rather than office snacks and commuting, I dropped to the lowest healthy weight I've had in my entire adult life. And so just personally, my life got better. And so, of course, I see the return to office from my perspective in part. If I were still working with Amazon, I would be crestfallen by this. I would be, because my life was markedly better, and I believe my performance, as measured by the metrics of my team, was as good or better. And so I would have real trouble with this, even given that I feel some loneliness. Now, I am the first to say there is use in occasional in-person meetings. So I can see bringing the team together for special planning or for all hands or for occasional days in the office, but I would not really want to return to office myself. If we look more broadly, frankly, very early in the pandemic, I had employees telling me on the sly, oh, hey, yeah, I've moved out of state. And we didn't have any policy for how to deal with this. Or we had a policy that was unenforceable, where we were supposed to keep people local. But I had employees who, for many different reasons, moved. And of course, that's spread. I'm not sure Amazon, of course, has the ability with technology to know where their employees live. I wish I had access to that data. It's my belief that a lot of Amazon employees no longer live where Amazon's official records say they do. Their records say that they live in Bellevue or whatever, and they're actually in an Airbnb in Montana or at home with their parents in Des Moines, Iowa, or whatever. And I think not all those people are going to come back. And I've spoken to some who feel they cannot come back, that their life has evolved in those 3 years and they can't make that change. So Amazon is going to see some attrition. Now, I think we should address the elephant in the living room. Amazon is causing some attrition by choice. They're laying people off. And so the elephant in the living room is right now, short term, Amazon has a simple equation. They have a number of people they want to reduce their payroll by. They have an estimate of how many people will resign or not come back to the office and be let go over the policy. It's simple math to say we want to get rid of X, Y people aren't going to come back, X minus Y equals layoff number, and they announced a recent layoff of 9,000 people. Now, I want to be clear. Some people say, oh, that's actually why Amazon has returned to office. They're trying to get people to quit so they don't have to pay severance. I personally don't believe that. I think it's a matter of them having an estimate and being willing to accept it, not intention. And the reason I believe that is, whether you agree, I'm not here to debate how Amazon determines layoffs, but I believe that Amazon feels they're doing it based on specific teams they want to reduce and specific performance profiles that they're okay losing. If people who are high performers quit because they can't return to office, you're getting a scattered departure over all teams, and you're getting a mix of performers. Amazon cares incredibly much about raising the bar. Ideally, they would want to control each person who doesn't come back. That said, I believe that they have looked at this and decided that they can accept the losses. Now, they might be wrong. They might be surprised, and either more people will leave than they expected or more people will stay. But I think we'd be naive to believe that they haven't at least come up with an estimate and decided it's acceptable.
That's a really interesting perspective. I feel like I've also kind of been just trying to figure out why, or if they have thought about the numbers that they will lose with this RTO, and how they came up with the equation. And I haven't kind of seen it all laid out like that, so I appreciate that from a mathematical, logical, data-driven perspective.
Yeah, well, it's big. It's big in that. What is the current signature count roughly on your petition?
Oh, 30. I mean, I think we sent it off with 30,000 roughly signatures. Now there's close to it's over that now in the Slack channel.
Yeah. So, as you may know, many people would be afraid to put their name on a petition like that. Whether or not they should be is another discussion. But I hear from people, even in response to my post on LinkedIn, they message me directly and say, well, I can't say anything publicly, but here's what I think, or here's my opinion. So we know that whatever number aren't thrilled with return to office is larger than the 30,000 who are willing to sign something publicly. Now, it's a bad economy and other jobs aren't easily available. So many of those 30,000 people probably will suck it up and go into the office, even though they don't love it. But we can also believe that many won't. And then there's the silent people, like some of the people who've contacted me, that are planning on their next move because they can't return to the office or don't feel they can, but haven't necessarily signed your petition because they don't want to tell anyone. So it's hard to know the numbers, but even a small percentage of that 30,000 plus the silent group behind them is quite a few thousand employees. So I do have to believe Amazon has estimated that. Again, their estimate might be wrong. I think obviously it would be much worse in a better economy. And that to me is the real rub for Amazon, is what's the cost of this policy, not in 2023, but in 2024 and beyond. Now, Amazon, of course, has this doctrine of one-way and two-way doors. You're probably familiar with it. Jeff's written about it. It's in his letters. And the idea being, is a decision reversible? So Amazon definitely has the power to get to 2024 and say, okay, we've improved our tools, or whatever reason they give, remote work is fine. But there is this perception that Amazon has already changed its mind on that once, that it said different teams can make up their own choice, and now it's come with the return to office mandate. A move back to supporting remote work, I think, would be viewed as impermanent, as, I think it's not a totally, as Amazon would prefer, two-way door, because what you've done in the past has an impact on how much you're trusted in the future. So bottom line, I think the return to office is a long-term talent cost to Amazon. That talent cost is going to get worse when the economy improves. What I don't know is how big. We'll see, right? May is coming. We'll see.
Absolutely. So based on your experience, Ethan, what advice would you give to these Amazon employees who are navigating this space of return to office, this mandate, and advocating for themselves for remote work to continue to happen?
Yeah. So first, it's unfortunate. Um, it's unfortunate that for whatever reason, the Amazon leadership hasn't felt free or a need to address some of the more substantive points raised by your petition, other public sources. These questions seem reasonable. And at least so far, Amazon hasn't chosen to entertain them. Now, there's another Jeff doctrine that is not as well published, but is worth discussing. Jeff had a belief where he said, be willing to be misunderstood for long periods of time. A leader and Amazon must be willing to be misunderstood. And in fact, that can be good. If people misperceive what you're doing, they may make actions based on wrong information that leads competitors down blind alleys. That may be at play here. So if we postulate for a minute something I don't personally believe, but is possible. Let's say Amazon leadership has good reasons backed up by data where they believe that having people in the office is a long-term competitive advantage. In that situation, the argument for not sharing that data would be, why tell Google? We have a secret. We've figured out that long-term, we're going to do better with people in the office. Why tell our competitors? Instead, yes, we're going to take some lumps. We're even going to take some lumps from our own employees. We're going to take some lumps in the press, but you know what? That's all noise in the end because we're doing the right thing. And there's no need to advertise where we're smarter than others. That is the best reason I can come up with, knowing Amazon leadership principles, for silence. The problem is, normally Amazon, when it tried to be willing to be misunderstood, that was with external entities, with competitors. It's your own employees. It's thousands, tens of thousands of your own dedicated blue badge employees. And even if this isn't your intent, emotionally, it feels like being given the finger. And that's tough to swallow. As someone who loves Amazon, whose career was made by Amazon, who's able to sit here on my own doing what I love because of Amazon, I feel like that lack of communication is a mistake. There has to be some better way to engage and persuade your employees. And I also think it falls under two leadership principles. I feel like it falls under earned trust. You're burning trust with your employee base. Even if they sign up and say, yes, ma'am, yes, sir, we'll be in the office, you're burning trust. I've even heard from employees who want to return to the office, who prefer the office, that on behalf of their colleagues who don't, they feel bad. The second place it feels like it's a violation of leadership principles is strive to be Earth's best employer. How can you be Earth's best employer when tens of thousands of your own employees are putting forward a well-reasoned, data-driven Amazonian-style case and you're not responding to it? That doesn't add up to me. And I know, not all by any means, but I know a number of members of the S team to a varying degree, and I have enormous respect for them. And I'll admit I don't understand. I'll also admit they're very smart people and they may have better data and be smarter than me. But I would say to them, you're hurting a lot of people. I hope you're really sure what you're doing because this cost seems unnecessarily high. So that's kind of my emotional and rational argument. At least share your reasoning to the degree you can. to just stand quietly and say, nope, come back, nope, come back. So you ask the question, what can an individual do? Unfortunately, having read the FAQ that was put out on Back to Office, the FAQ doesn't offer much hope. It says that you need an SVP to sign off on each case of remote work. It kind of changes the topic and says, oh, we have commuter benefits and childcare benefits. I think if you want to work remotely, your best opportunities would be to look and see if you can get a valid health exception, whether that would be psychological trauma or whatever. But even then, if most of Amazon goes back to the office and you're the unusual person who stays remote, I think there's a long-term cost to that, because now you're the like odd person out who's not present with the team. And I can't see that working out well at promo time, at review time, because generally not being part of the norm and part of the group isn't a great career advancement strategy. So I don't have, honestly, based on what I've read, much message of hope for those people hoping to see the policy change. And while I would never want to advocate for people to leave Amazon, I think if you can't go back into the office, you do have to start down the mental path of what is my plan B, at least so that you aren't caught by surprise if you have to use that plan B. And that's another reason, like, given I can't escape that conclusion, I wish Amazon would say more, because I never want to recommend to Amazonians where I had a great career that it can't be great for them.
Ethan, thank you so much for that response. And this entire interview has been super informative and insightful to me. And hopefully, I believe it will also be insightful to the community that participates in watching this. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for joining me and participating. Are there any closing words that you'd like to share before we end the call?
Yeah, just a few. I want to say, Cody, thank you for reaching out to me and inviting me. I want to be clear. It's quite possible, since you organized this petition, that some Amazonians who are friends of mine will feel that by talking to you or expressing my opinion here, I'm somehow attacking or undermining Amazon. That's not my intention at all. It's to express honest bafflement, because we're encouraged as Amazonians, even though I no longer work there, to have backbone and disagree before we commit. And as I look at that, I'm trying to tell Amazon, this looks bad. It looks harmful. And you may have a strong position right now where you're willing to lay people off anyway, but that isn't the company you want to be. And look, Amazonians understand they're expected to commit, but that is usually after the assumption of some discussion. So the Amazon leaders owe me nothing. I'm an outsider. I had a great career there. They did well by me. I hope I did well by them. They owe me nothing. I understand that. But for your employee base, I think they owe consideration and engagement. And so I'm not trying to undermine Amazon at all. I'm actually trying to help you avoid a landmine, because putting additional thousands of people who want to work from Amazon on the street saying, yeah, they wouldn't help me out, they wouldn't even say why, that's not a long-term brand message that helps Amazon hire and develop the best, in my opinion. And so I'm really hopeful that Amazon will invest some energy, at least, in what I call damage control. And I'm also intellectually curious. I want to know. Again, they owe me nothing, but I can't wait. Someday it will come out, whether it was a good decision or not, it will come out why Amazon chose the path, and I will be reading that with rapt attention. So I just hope we end up in a better place.
Thank you so much, Ethan. I appreciate this.
Yeah. And thank you, Cody. I wish you the very best, in ultimately both your own career, which you probably built a heck of a network. Great work there, but also in getting some engagement. I have to believe, I have faith that one day you'll get engagement on this. I just hope it's sooner rather than later.
Thank you for your kind words, sincerely. And I think with this interview and your amazing points, it's going to push us forward in a positive direction. So thank you again.
Yeah, my pleasure.